Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Wilson Center, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to a discussion on the outlook for strategic competition in the semiconductor industry. My name is Don McClellan. I'm the international co-chair of the Wilson Center, Wilson National Cabinet. And I'm joined today by 5 distinguished panelists. Duncan Wood, who is the VP of Strategy and New Initiatives at the Wilson Center. Alexandra Helfgott, also with Duncan in the Office of Strategy and New Initiatives, and also co-author of a recent publication we'll mention today on supply chain resilience in the semiconductor industry. Kelly Wicker, Director of Science and Technology Innovation Program at the Center. Cordell Hull, a Global Fellow at the Wilson Center, whose scholarly work includes supply chain perspectives on the semiconductor industry and critical minerals. And Jimmy Goodrich, VP Global Policy, the Semiconductor Industry Association. As is the mission of the Kissinger Institute, one of our event sponsors, informed engagement is a cornerstone of US and China relations. And today's session is meant to inform, but not exhaust all of the potential issues that arise in the semiconductor industry and the strategic competition that we see between the US and China. We hope that this will be the start of a fruitful dialogue you will all have with panelists today and with the Wilson Center and others. We will be taking questions, so please do in the webcast. If you have a question, please do submit it online, and we'll do the best we can to get to your questions. So let me jump right in, if I may. To Alexandra, on behalf of the Wilson Center, you and Duncan recently published a well-researched and comprehensive report on building resilience in the semiconductor supply chain. You called it Of Swans and Rhinos. Can you tell us a little bit about the report, why the title, and what the key takeaways are?
So the spring of this year, the Wilson Center convened a group of industry experts, government officials, and academics for a series of discussions on the semiconductor supply chain. And these conversations serve as the basis for this report. Our goal was to focus on the long-term, over-the-horizon challenges facing the semiconductor supply chain and have this be a complementary resource to ongoing conversations that were being held by other think tanks and, of course, the Biden administration about the semiconductor supply chain. As we know, the Biden administration has done the 100-day and 1-year review of the semiconductor supply chain. It's a very relevant issue, and we wanted to really focus on the long-term and over-the-horizon challenges facing the industry. The title of the report is Of Swans and Rhinos, and we chose this title because it really highlights 2 of the key challenges facing the semiconductor supply chain. The first are black swan events, which is a term for events that are characterized by their unique, unpredictable, and unprecedented nature. Technically, the pandemic is not a black swan event because we've seen pandemics before. Black swan events are events that we just absolutely cannot predict, but with hindsight and looking in retrospect, they become more obvious in nature. And the very nature of a black swan event means that we can't predict it. And so the emphasis of this focus in our semiconductor supply chain report is not guessing what black swan events could be coming down the pipeline, but rather building resilience and fostering resilience to ensure that we can respond appropriately when black swan events occur. And the second portion of the title, Gray Rhinos, that refers to events and challenges that we see coming down the pipeline, kind of like the elephant in the room, but a bigger scale. And a clear example of this is climate change. That's a clear, tangible example of a gray rhino issue, a huge problem coming down the pipeline, but the huge scale and nature of the issue sometimes prevents individuals and companies and organizations, governments from responding appropriately. And so that's how we categorize the challenges and risks coming down the pipeline in terms of the semiconductor supply chain. And for us, one of the biggest takeaways from this report is that we, government, industry, not trying to entirely eliminate risk from the semiconductor supply chain, but rather foster the capacity to react and pivot when problems arise. And so there's really a desperate need for an integrated, multidimensional strategy for the short, medium, and long term that takes into account the rapidly changing environment of the industry and the needs of companies that are requiring semiconductors. And so this absolutely requires the support of government, industry, academics, think tanks. And those are our main conclusions from the report without getting into too much detail here.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. I read the report, and what was amazing about it was the, again, comprehensive nature of it. It's a great primer, but it's also a great tool to understand what kind of potential ways there can be to remove some of those bottlenecks. So maybe I'll ask a question and frame this one to Duncan if I can. So when we think of the supply chain, we think of these bottlenecks kind of after COVID starts in production, and some of those have seemed to be loosening a bit now and follow some of the recommendations and observations you make in the report. But now it would seem that the dialogue in Washington and elsewhere about the semiconductor supply chain appears to be centered less on supply demand and more about US-China competition, framed that way. Can you comment on that and what it means for the type of issues you're tracking at the center?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I think that the semiconductor supply chain is similar in this way to many of the other critical supply chains for the United States, in the sense that whilst we of course worry about interruptions of supply and the questions of security of supply, increasingly we're concerned about a whole range of factors and values that are inherent in supply chains. Obviously, for a while now, we've been concerned about ESG issues, environment, social, and governance issues, and they remain highly pertinent. At the same time, we know that supply chains can be intimately and directly connected to questions of national security. And over the past couple of years, and particularly during 2022, we've become painfully aware of the connection between supply chains and geopolitics, of course. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the threat of Chinese aggression against Taiwan, all of these factors and more have really shown us that we need to be concerned about how geopolitics impacts upon supply chains, but we've also come to understand how supply chains themselves impact geopolitics and the distribution of power. And that brings us, of course, to the question that is included, or the term that's included in the title of this event, strategic competition. Because what we're seeing there is really the United States beginning to think more and more about how economic policy, trade policy, impact upon its relationship with the rest of the global economy, of course, but in particular in terms of its competition with China and how that's going to play out in the long term. And for that reason, I think that's why we're seeing here at the Wilson Center a growing emphasis on questions of strategic competition, a growing emphasis on how US-China relations impact upon almost every issue that we cover. And of course, we're excited that we're going to be able to launch a new institute, the WABA Institute on Strategic Competition, in 2023, which will bring a lot of this work, which already exists, together, but will also carry us forward to adopt a more integrated approach to the question of strategic competition.
Well, thank you for mentioning the WABA Center. It is definitely difficult to have a conversation where China doesn't come up, where semiconductor doesn't come up, where supply chain doesn't come up, and the different tools that have been used to engage in this competition, this competition, both dialogue and policy. So let's talk about some of those tools at the moment. So maybe asking Cordell, if you could comment. A number of industry players I speak with reference October 7th. Like a watershed date. It's sort of emblazoned. For those that might not know what that is, they're referring to Department of Commerce, BIS, export control restrictions, which affect the provision of certain tools, products, and service of U.S. persons to Chinese semiconductor companies. Much more kind of thoughtful and complex than my brief description. So apologies to those that understand it far better. So let me ask you, Cordell, maybe you could describe a little bit in more detail than I could what it was, why it was so significant, and maybe just try to tease out for us kind of the policy goals and why it became kind of why people use that date as if it's emblazoned in the lexicon of competition in the semiconductor industry.
Sure. Thanks, Don. And so the October 7th controls are really something that we can spend an entire hour on, and it gets very, very weedy very, very quickly. So I'll do my best to keep it very top level, and maybe in the course of the questions we can dig down a little deeper. But there were sort of two main pieces of the controls that were issued on October 7th, and the first was stopping the provision of high-end artificial intelligence chips to China. It was something that the Department of Commerce had put an interim stop to sometime in September. They then formalized the rule on October 7th and really trying to cinch off a number of companies from sending very high-end AI chips to China purportedly for military or intelligence use. The second key component of it was putting restrictions on semiconductor tooling to China, but only to indigenous Chinese semiconductor companies. So think SMIC, YMTC, and CXMT, the latter two being Chinese indigenous memory companies. The tooling was set at a particular level for logic chips. It was 14 nanometers and more advanced, and for memory it was a similar tier. And the policy sort of animating all of that was a continued strike toward China's increasing military civil fusion. And going back several years now, when I was in the U.S. government, we were watching this very carefully. I can only imagine in my time since leaving the U.S. government, it is probably not slowed very much. But in Chinese society, there's very few lines between civilian and military, unlike we have here, where companies are free to work or not work on military contracts. In China, it's slightly different. And so the policies you've seen preceding October 7th and October 7th being sort of more direct than a number of previous policies really are trying to get at that military civil fusion and ensuring that U.S. technology and allied technology, which I'll mention briefly in just a minute, aren't being used in ways that are inimical to U.S. national security. The controls were unilateral, meaning the U.S. proceeded on them alone, but there has been significant press reporting on the U.S.'s goals to try and get the Netherlands and the Japanese to come along with them, particularly on the tooling pieces of it. According to the press, that seems like it is coming to fruition. TBD on what the timing of that will be, but certainly a positive development, because export controls really are a time-limited solution. They get less and less effective each day. And the way you make these enduring is having the allies on board. So it's a positive development. We'll see where it goes. I'm hopeful that the U.S. government can seal the deal.
And if I can, just kind of as a follow-up to that, how is kind of success measured? You know, when you think about the impact that these measures are intended to have, is there a sense in kind of the work that you do, the studying that you're doing on the topic, when we would come up for air and say, well, these policies had the outcome that was both desired and anticipated?
It's certainly one of the hardest things that you can do in this is figuring out what success looks like. In several of these controls, the goal really is to ensure that China or any adversary really doesn't use the technology to achieve some breakthrough that the U.S. government doesn't want to happen. Is success delaying that by a day, a week, a month, a year? Is it getting them to abandon the program entirely? It's hard to say. I mean, I think in a number of these, when you're dealing with actors that are acting contrary to our national security, delay, I think, can be a measure of success. So it's I would argue it's a process that really defies an easy definition for success. From what I've heard from folks in the administration, the early returns are this seems to be having the intended effect. And one piece that I neglected to mention that I should have is that it introduced a U.S. person control. So what it prohibited folks from doing for U.S. citizens, legal permanent residents, et cetera. It prohibited them from working on these tools and these chips for indigenous Chinese fabs. And there are several folks over there in China and elsewhere that are working on these. And this control actually required the companies to come in and seek a license for these folks to do it. The early returns I've heard from folks in government is they're very positive on how the controls are being implemented and the desired effects.
So thank you, Cordell. With that, and I'm also going to invite my panelists to, definitely jump in on any of these questions and feel free to follow on and don't let me direct the moderation of it. But I do want to bring in the industry view. And as I said at the outset, we're privileged to have Jimmy Goodrich join us from SIA. Maybe to bring in that industry view, Jimmy, Can you tell us what U.S.-China competition means for the industry participants you speak with? And you and I have talked about this in the past as well. What are they doing to plan for the future, for what the future state of the industry may look like? Is there a sense that targeted actions, are they one and done, or is there more of this to come? And how does industry think about this, prepare? What are you hearing?
Well, thanks for having me here, and great question, and already a lot of insightful thoughts and comments from Cordell and others on this topic. I think what I would add is that, if we just step back and look at the global semiconductor ecosystem, it's a global market and it's a global supply chain. And, certainly right now, in many ways, China has a very influential role across parts of that supply chain, particularly as an end market for the assembly of electronics and then the sale of electronics to Chinese consumers and those around the world. Overall, though, I would say that right now, China's role as an assembly hub is actually greater than their role as a market for consumption of digital products with semiconductors in them, although it's still very large. We actually did a study in 2019 that found that, in 2020, that found that Chinese headquartered companies account for around 20 to 25% of demand of semiconductor sales, but more than 40% of semiconductors are shipped to China. And that's because a lot of multinational companies also have, think the Apples of the world, their assembly operations in the China market. So no matter where a company sits in the supply chain, whether it's materials, equipment, software, chip design or fabrication, or where they're from, the US, Taiwan, Netherlands, Japan, the China market's going to be this sort of increasingly challenging and difficult, but reality that people have to deal with in order to be competitive. And to be competitive in the semiconductor industry requires two really important things, scale and innovation. Scale firms are able to derive that from being able to access all markets and then be able to take that revenue and plow it back into research development. And on average, US semiconductor companies actually invest around 20% of their research development into 20% of their revenues into research development, which is higher than most other countries, even in the chip industry. And that's allowed US companies in this kind of virtuous cycle to stay ahead. And so as challenges between the US and China increase, we've, disagreement over many issues at a geopolitical level. That's trickling down to the industry with the October 7 rules, with policies in Beijing around intellectual property, around market access, around localization. You've got the world's largest market and the world's largest economy at loggerheads with each other. There's going to create a lot of tension. And what that's meant is that firms increasingly are being forced to choose a side in some cases, forced to potentially walk away from billions of dollars of investments, and instability around the inability to plan forward several years, not knowing what the environment is going to look like, makes it very difficult for a multi-billion-dollar chip company to decide where their next investment is going to be, what technology are they going to be. So the direct impact of the October 7 rules is probably far outweighed by the indirect impact, which is, again, the inability to see forward very far from a business planning perspective, but also the psychological effect that it has, this sort of chilling effect where, US companies, because this was a unilateral restriction, are now kind of put at an unlevel playing field disadvantage with their counterparts from around the world, particularly in the China market, because they're not subject to the same restriction. And in many cases, we're hearing about how US content and technology is being designed out, even in Chinese air conditioning or auto companies that aren't subject to the rules because they're fearful that one day the rules could spread to them. So, while the US industry, we completely understand and realize that we're in a new dynamic environment with China. The strategic paradigm has shifted, but at the same time, we also want to ensure that at the minimum, government actions and restrictions understand what the unintended consequences may be and are done with our allies to ensure that when we do need to take action to address, the US needs to address a national security concern, it could be effective and that the allies are on board and there's not an alternative substitute technology that they can source from another location.
Don, if I can just jump in very quickly here, what I'd like to add to what Jimmy has just said is really that this is one of the major strengths of the process of writing the report of Swans and Rhinos, which is that it's really easy to sit in a think tank and look at a question of geopolitics and the semiconductor industry and why it's so important, and come to conclusions, and then you put them against the reality of the industry, which is much more complex. And you see how the consequences and the implications of policy play down. And that's why it's an entirely dynamic process that we see underway right now, which is that legislation is passed. Export controls are imposed, and then we begin to see the pushback against that. And that's something which makes this fascinating, and why semiconductors, as with many other supply chains, are so complex, and there really is no silver bullet to solving the problem, because whatever stance you take on this, there are going to be costs one way or the other. And so, I like to make that point, because at the Wilson Center, it's vitally important that we engage with industry, not just with policymakers and academics, because that's really where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah,
please go ahead.
I just jump in very quickly. I mean, from my old perch in government, it's exceedingly difficult in government to do that as well, and to really figure out where the rubber meets the road. So the think tank challenge is similar in the government.
I think this there are a couple words I've heard already in the comments being made, and clearly the role of allies in education, educating policymakers, and I like the way Jimmy phrased it. That second, third order effects, the unintended consequence of actions, need to be kind of thought through. That doesn't mean that the policy isn't sound and going to achieve the same objectives, but to the extent that there's an interplay and the ability to have that if I can use the phrase semiconductor literacy in the dialogue, so we kind of at least know consciously what those second, third order effects might be. Probably a great place to bring in our director of the Science, Technology, Innovation Program. So Kelly, what I'd love to ask you about is, let's take the conversation to an area of innovation as an example. So when we circle the wagons around the industry, if you will, one of the advantages that we've all had in humanity has been the advancement of technologies, particularly semiconductors, has made our lives, tremendously more safe, has made our lives more, enriched in many ways because of the innovation. That's led to advances in chip technologies. So I guess I'll ask a more provocative question of you, and then as you think about this, you could also kind of tell us a little bit more about STIP and what we're doing at the center through the Science, Technology, Innovation Program. But hasn't the industry benefited from cooperation on a global scale, tapping best resources, whatever country they might be in? And how has some of this, both competition kind of rhetoric as well as policy actions, kind of affected that, as the way we think about the geopolitics of innovation? And then maybe tell us a little bit about the program itself and what you're doing to help both educate and provide some kind of perspective on innovation.
Yeah, thanks, Don. I think you're exactly right. And in the context of innovation, the resources in the supply chain that we're most concerned about are the people that are doing scientific research. So kind of zooming out from just chips. Science and discovery thrive in an environment where diverse ideas and expertise can freely flow. You see this in the author lists on the scientific journal publication, the citations. We've got brilliant people who are working together across national borders, or brilliant people who immigrate to work and study. The globalized chip supply chain encourages this environment, and the United States has really benefited from this free flow. So if we can, and I'm not sold on the idea that we can, we should separate the question of scientific interchange and innovation from the question of supply, fabrication, and exports. But even if this is possible, it's going to be really, really difficult. And I want to kind of explore two facets to this question. First, what happens when we all have this mindset of defending our own territory? It's not a question I have the answer to, but let's quantify a little bit about the impact it would have in the US. So China is already competing harder for tech workers and researchers, which is going to change global attitudes. And this has major implications for the United States. If you just look at faculty members at American post-secondary institutions, a 2019 estimate put the percentage of foreign-born faculty at more than 22%, which is significantly higher than our overall immigration rate. And then international students also make up the majority of students at US academic programs for a number of STEM fields. It can be as high as 70 to 74% for students in fields like computer science, electrical engineering, which is kind of an astonishing rate. The students that are in those programs, they're likely to stay in the United States. But if other countries start focusing seriously on wooing them back home, we're going to see our tech talent pipeline falter. But even the way that I just framed that question has at its heart this zero-sum mentality, probably because we're sitting here talking about a chip war. And the question I think really is, can we have the kind of significant major breakthroughs that lead to shaving nanometers off of chip transistors if we have a zero-sum mindset? I'm not sure. So what does all this mean for how we fund innovation? That's the second half of my question here. Why does the state need to play a role? A lot of the R&D funding comes from the industry itself, but researchers earlier this year looked at the impact of geopolitical risk on companies' investment in innovation. The results were frankly pretty grim. The number of patents were stifled as geopolitical risk went up, and the patents that were filed saw a decrease in financial and scientific value. Companies also tended to pursue fewer areas of innovation, and they started avoiding new and rapidly evolving areas, which is where we usually get those major breakthroughs. The effect was more significant in an environment of threat as opposed to an environment of actual action. And this effect lingered, peaking around 2 years after the initial rise in geopolitical risk. That to me means that state funding is absolutely essential to keep innovation rolling, especially in this environment where we are, where threats are already rising. State funding has always been key for fundamental research and pre-research, as well as workforce development. That's that special sauce that the industry can't always provide R&D wise. And we do see some of this investment targeted in the CHIPS and Science Act, and we'd love to see more. My overall question, I guess, is will our friends stay our friends for the purposes of innovation as this evolves? We're doing a really good job of trying to play this right with Europe and our friends in Asia, and that's an advantage for us. China doesn't really have that way forward. They're going it alone. But I think science flourishes when the whole globe can participate with one another, not just us and our buds. And I think it's important that we try to keep these research pathways open.
That's well, and I will also compliment the way STIP has provided over the years good guidance and of kind of what are these unintended consequences. Work and innovation still occur. Open innovation, open hardware platforms, open other platforms. So I encourage folks to kind of dip in and see the great work that's being done there. So we made it almost halfway through a conversation and haven't yet to mention Taiwan in the context of China-U.S. competition as it relates to the semiconductor industry. It becomes definitely a topic. And Cordell, I know you and I talked in the past a little bit about this. Wouldn't mind maybe starting with you, but asking others to jump in on this topic. We hear talk of Silicon Shield around Taiwan. And while I tell anyone listening in that this could be a full day session or many-hour session, there's plenty of additional Wilson Center and Kissinger Institute content on the topic of Taiwan and China. I'd maybe just narrow the framing here in a few words, maybe Cordell, what's the debate around how measures taken to reduce industry reliance on Taiwan as the center of advanced semiconductor manufacturing? And for everyone's knowledge, I think SAA, Jimmy's team, put together a really great kind of compendium of where all the semiconductor manufacturing is. About 92% is, of advanced manufacturing nodes, as everyone knows by now, is in Taiwan. So even from just a commercial point of view, which is the subject of the Rhinos and Black Swan paper, from a commercial point of view, it makes sense to reduce reliance on Taiwan. But what does that do in framing this discussion of Silicon Shield? Maybe you could just spend a couple minutes describing what that is and what the debate on either side is without necessarily particularly taking a side, but just describe it to us in a few words, what people refer to when they say that.
Absolutely. Well, the Silicon Shield refers to Taiwan, as you mentioned, manufacturing, holding north of 90% of the market share in advanced semiconductor manufacturing, as being a hedge against China or other adversaries moving in on Taiwan. and for at least China's purposes, trying to, as the PRC would say, reunify. It's the sort of thing, the Silicon Shield is why we have defending Taiwan as a front burner conversation here in Washington. And I would speculate why the president has said 4 times that if Taiwan is attacked, the United States would come to its defense. The other side of that point, of course, is a number of actions we've taken here in the US to include the Chips and Science Act, which is sort of our most recent dabble in industrial policy and providing grants for chip makers and others in the supply chain to try and build more of that here. There have been efforts that we at the Wilson Center have looked at in terms of nearshoring and ally shoring to try and make the semiconductor supply chain a little more resilient. Having 92% of the advanced semiconductor manufacturing done in Taiwan, of course, becomes a challenge if the PRC moves to choke off the Taiwan Strait, if it moves out of the South China Sea on some of the islands that have been militarized over the past decade or so. Really produces a conundrum both for industry and for government. U.S. technological leadership would be quite stunted if we're not able to get those chips here or get them assembled elsewhere and get the products here. So that is, in very briefly, sort of what the Silicon Shield is and why it's important both to industry and to government. But I certainly know that my co-panelists have some thoughts as well.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Maybe I could just, oh, go ahead, Kelly, and then I'll add something.
I just wanted to chime in. We've got some research going on at STIP right now looking at how important the Silicon Shield is actually to the Taiwanese protests against the moves we're making. You know, they do have a very lucrative corner on a significant part of the market here. And so there's a lot of questions about whether, you know, obviously this probably is a big factor for their national security when it comes to China, but how much is that really what's at play here? And how much is it just wanting to protect their footprint?
Jimmy, do you want to jump in on that too?
Yeah, I mean, I think just overall, you know, there's no denying that Taiwan is a very vital link in the global, you know, semiconductor supply chain. I think a lot of the facts and figures were cited, but it's not just in the advanced logic. For example, in assembly, test, and packaging, and semiconductor design, even in equipment and materials, memory production, for example, Taiwan is a very vital node in the supply chain. Beyond that, it's also innovated basically the whole business model of contract manufacturing, not just in the foundry space for semiconductors, but also electronic manufacturing services. Think downstream, original equipment manufacturers like Foxconn, Pegatron, Wistron. All of these are vital to the global electronics industry. So, you know, Taiwan is basically a irreplaceable node in the supply chain, just like the Netherlands is, just like Japan, just like the United States is. There's no way that any one country is going to be able to completely decouple themselves from Taiwan or any other country, because we all have to work together. But we are now starting to see that because of the geopolitical tensions and the need for diversity in supply chains, that TSMC is investing, for example, in Arizona. We have Japan as well. So you see a recognition that sort of putting your eggs into one basket longer term is not sustainable, even for some of the Taiwanese companies. MediaTek is investing heavily here in the United States. So I think you're going to see a more diversified investment portfolio on behalf of not just US firms, but Taiwanese too. And that's positive, and that will never, and we shouldn't be independent of each other, but there'll be more resilience.
I like the way you say that. I mean, because it is difficult, and I know that SAA and BCG has done a nice study on that, on the cost of self-sufficiency and its really impracticality. So we have to cooperate with, globally as a global supply chain, reduce bottlenecks where we can. Again, a great subject of the report that was just released, but also be conscious of the geopolitical kind of risks of putting those eggs in the same basket. Let me go back to Kelly, if I could, maybe switching gears a little bit away from the manufacturing. Now let's talk about the chips themselves and kind of the uses. You know, we talk a lot, and Cordell did a nice job describing the Department of Commerce export controls, which, you know, usually are couched in terms of dual use, products need to be managed, monitored, restricted in certain ways. When I think of semiconductors, as was said in a different panel, very few of us ever buy a semiconductor. We buy the product that the semiconductors are made from, although maybe some of this phone have actually purchased semiconductors, but most don't. So when we think about the way chips enable everything we do, and then we think about kind of policy to really limit what's more the end use of some of those chips. I know that you've discussed in the past some of the ways that chips are being used that have some policy concerns, or the way, let's say authoritarian countries might use chips for surveillance, for example. So maybe you could kind of talk a little bit about that in terms of when policy tries to counteract kind of an end use, what works, what doesn't work in your experience? How does policy kind of get at the end goal when we're talking about the ingredient being chips that could find their way into many products that have multiple uses?
Yeah, I think, this is an important question because I think at this point we can say without a lot of exaggeration that chips are in everything. So policymaking needs to be careful because we can be like a bull in a china shop where we accidentally break a whole bunch of benign everyday uses of chips in the pursuit of a really specific goal. And this is somewhere where STIP really focuses its work kind of broadly. We're here to talk about where emerging tech is poorly understood for policy implications so that we can help policymakers educate themselves about these opportunities and find a way forward. So when we talk about chips, sometimes the layman can lose sight of the fact that chips are not monolithic. There are varying levels of power in a chip. And many of the chips that we as the United States are involved in producing are going to be on the high end of compute power. Those are the ones we're really concerned about the end user for. And specifically, I know we keep talking about China, but it's just on everyone's minds about this subject. China depends on the more sophisticated chips from the US and other players for a number of uses because they're not producing those chips for the most part in their own borders. We're most concerned with where they're using them for military and surveillance uses. I think Cordell noted earlier that the US is already taking action that indicates that we're concerned about China's AI technology plans, and there's good reason for that. For example, the Chinese have been working toward leveraging chips in AI edge computing. It's going to allow surveillance cameras to do facial recognition processing in the camera itself, and it's going to reduce response time. The industry can't control end users. We saw that in 2015, the Obama administration tried to ban the sale of a specific Intel chip for Chinese military use. But when we saw it pop up in Chinese military technology, so clearly there were pathways around that were able to be leveraged. But we did see in the AI surveillance tech example, the Chinese capacity to implement that technology has been significantly limited by our moves to bar their access to the software used to design high-end chips and the bans on their ability to purchase those high-level chips. So their dependency on us for that higher tier of chips has made export controls have some teeth, I think. But I would love to hear thoughts from my fellow panelists on industry's role in this question of authoritarian uses of technology and thoughts on how government can promote smart action.
So yeah, maybe I could add a couple of thoughts there. I mean, obviously from a semiconductor industry perspective, nobody wants to see their technology misused or abused. And actually there are a lot of different regulatory and corporate policies that companies follow around the world to try and ensure that. But recognizing that ultimately, if there's determined bad actors, they will likely find ways to get access to the technology. And we're finding this, for example, right now in the battlefield in Ukraine, where drones from Russia are showing up with semiconductors that were sourced from around the world. And what's key in that instance is that in this case, it appears that none of the companies actually sold those directly. Obviously, to Russia, there are rules that prevent them from doing that. But because there are 1.15 trillion chips shipped last year, they're so ubiquitous that literally you can break open a washing machine and probably repurpose most of the chips that you would need from that washing machine into something like a tank or other type of piece of military hardware. The same goes actually for the security cameras There are a lot of peaceful uses for security cameras in Western democracies. And a lot of the chips that are used in those tend to be lower end because they're low power. They need to be able to operate for long periods of time without consuming a lot of power. So as a result of that, a lot of the semiconductor technology in those endpoints tends to be lower end. Where and the industry, in addition, does a lot of work around compliance, ensuring that they're not doing business with firms on government blacklists, that they're doing due diligence, and it requires a partnership with government, in that the government can provide more information about bad actors to industry so that we can take the steps necessary. But at the same end, I think we also recognize that there are some certain specific technologies that the government doesn't want to see authoritarian states use. And for example, the October 7 rules, the threshold around the most high performance AI chips, I think, the industry kind of recognizes the goal that the US government's been trying to achieve. The challenge, however, is that longer term, as we set a specific threshold of technology, for example, the threshold today only impacts, 2 or 3 chips made that are used in supercomputing. But those same chips in 5 years may actually be in your laptop or your phone from a performance capability. And so whether or not the rules and the regulations that are static can keep up with the technology of tomorrow, I think is going to be a key challenge moving forward.
Don, if I could just quickly jump in here, I think that the issues that have been raised here are they're becoming one of the most important debates of our time. Really, it's about the technologies that we're coming up with, the advanced technologies. Are they going to be used for good or evil? Ultimately, it's going to be both. But how do we reduce the scope for their ill use around the world? And one country acting alone, whether it is the United States or Japan, they're just not going to be able to have much of an impact upon that. And so, what I think this debate and this question really raises is the critical need, once again, for diplomacy, cooperation, and coordination, and the recognition that in a highly integrated global economy, the United States needs to work very, very closely with allies if it's going to have a positive impact on these questions.
That's thank you, Duncan. That actually is kind of the theme of the next topic. And in fact, I'm going to ask a question that we got from the audience and remind those on the phone, if you'd like to, please, or on Zoom, please submit through the website questions you might have. I have a couple already, and one is on this exact point, Duncan, of allied reactions and allied support. So the question comes in like this. So Jimmy, you particularly emphasized the need for collaboration with allies as it relates to tech restrictions, and I think others have said it. Alexandra said it at the outset as well. How does America need to consider the important role? Let's take a look at this of South Korean companies in semiconductors as it seeks to resolve disputes on EV tax credits. So maybe I'll frame it in the following way. Once we start to have a semiconductor policy that requires allied help for collective defense, we somewhat privatize the losses that might result if we're asking other countries to, go ahead and restrict their own, industries. But when they have issues that they want to resolve, conversely, that becomes part of the semiconductor dialogue. So maybe you could react to that. So how does America need to consider the important role of South Korean companies in semiconductors as it seeks to resolve disputes on EV tax credits and other things? If anyone wants to take that, I know it was keyed off of a comment that Jimmy made.
Let me launch into that, Don, but I'm sure that others have things to say. This was one of the issues that when we were preparing the report, we didn't think enough about, a mea culpa there, which was, yes, we recognize the importance of international cooperation. We do, that's inherent to all of our work, but we hadn't thought about how, providing an incentive structure for investment in the semiconductor supply chain here in the United States would have negative spillover effects on our allies. And the fact that, once the Chips and Science Act was passed, that there would be this negative backlash from a number of countries rather. And I heard this very, very clearly recently in a session that we held at the Wilson Center on the reaction of Korea, the Korean Republic, to to Chips and Science, as well as to the Inflation Reduction Act, which is that, these both of these policy initiatives hit at the heart of their economic model. And the fact is that we need to be a lot more sensitive to how these actions, which either we see in terms of strategic competition, US-China, or in terms of how do we incentivize and spur competitiveness here in the US economy, how do these play out with our friends and allies around the world? I mean, one good thing that we've seen is that there's an increasing awareness that the United States cannot act effectively without its North American partners, but we need to go a lot further than that. And the only way that the United States is actually going to be able to be competitive at the level of the global economy is by working more closely with its partners.
Terrific. If no one else wants to add into that, let me ask another question that came in from the audience as well. And this relates to the kind of nodes of technology. And I think, Jimmy, you mentioned this in terms of what we saw in Ukraine play out. And also, Kelly, you mentioned this in terms of innovation. But when we think about equipment that China, when we think about limiting equipment to China, we're limiting equipment to produce sub 14 nanometer devices. Everyone knows, sub 28 is kind of advanced. Sub 14 is even heroically advanced with the most advanced consumer electronics using those nodes. But some of the weapon systems that are capable of destruction and otherwise take a long time to develop and therefore use much older technologies. So when we think about policy making around managing nodes of technology, when it comes to defining that, and Cordell, you mentioned this a little bit too, when it comes to defining that, can we think about it advanced, not advanced? How do we think about the fact that some uses of technology that is older technology could still find their way into uses that, from a policy point of view, we want to prevent? So it goes back to, we want to prevent the outcome in the final product, but the ingredients can be not just the most advanced, but can be all sorts of dated or older technologies as well. Does anyone want to take on that question?
I can take a crack at it to start. I mean, you bring up a good point. A lot of these, even in U.S. weapon systems, rely on more mainstream nodes of technology. And that really is a challenge when you're in a position trying to come up with effective export controls. It's as you get sort of more less advanced, rather, in the logic node. I mean, it's the foreign availability goes much higher, and so you're making that assessment of, is there enough foreign availability that even if we cut it off to the U.S., U.S. makers from cutting it off, are the bad actors still going to get it? And the answer is oftentimes yes, as Jimmy pointed out in some of his remarks. The way they generally try to get at that is just through end user controls, and there are a number of ways to do that. There's the entity list, which is generally can't ship anything to a party on the entity list without a license. There's the military end user list, companies that the U.S. government has assessed. I mentioned military civil fusion earlier, that are military companies for a foreign adversary. Those generally come with presumptions of denial, even for less advanced chips. So as you go more legacy on the scale, it becomes more of an end user control rather than a destination or a node control. But it's a very hard line to draw.
Can I jump in on this question? Just in
yes,
terms
Alexandra, please.
Thank you. Pardon me, Cordell. Just in terms of supply and demand, something that Duncan and I found fascinating when we had these conversations with the working group in this report is that the semiconductor supply chain is it has a cyclical nature. So when we saw the internet bubble in 2000, the financial crisis in 2008, the pandemic in 2020, these challenges facing semiconductor supply and demand were not unprecedented at all. And so when you build up capacity, whether it's for newer semiconductors or less technologically advanced chips, is all part of a cycle. And so I think that's also important to consider when discussing questions like this is not unprecedented. We just need to think about it in terms of previous cycles that have been in the past. And I just want to reference a chart that was done by Accenture. It shows a 6-part cycle where when you have increased supply of semiconductors, the price drops, and then that encourages increased demand and increased consumption, and then fabs increase production, and it's just part of a bigger cycle that we need to take into consideration when thinking about questions of technology in terms of the semiconductor supply chain.
Okay. Thank you. Those are good responses and great questions. I'll encourage we still have time for more questions from our audience. I have one though. We talk a lot about competition, so I want to ask all of the panelists or anyone who wants to take it, and then I'd like to get multiple views from all of you. Are there areas where, despite competition between U.S. and China, we should be cooperating when it comes to semiconductor industry policy, standards? Kelly already mentioned, areas of innovation, but can we maybe talk about where cooperation should be the cornerstone, just to have a level playing field, or an ability to innovate and build on top of kind of known standards or otherwise? Anyone want to take that?
Let me take a first shot at it, Don. And I think everybody on this call recognizes that this is the reality in Washington today, which is that there's a lot of China bashing. If you want to get attention for any issue, you kind of add China to the equation. It's seen as being, the big issue of international relations today, or this decade in Washington. But the fact is that we do need to continue to cooperate with the Chinese on a number of issues. And just in this area, whilst I'm far from being an expert on semiconductors, in fact, two of the issues that we covered in the report, I think, are issues where increased or ongoing cooperation between China and the United States would be welcome. One of those is in terms of water use, and the other one is in terms of energy use. We all need to think about the ways in which we can make our industries more efficient and less harmful to the environment. Reducing our energy use in fabs is going to be an important component, not just in terms of climate change, but really in terms of how do we actually meet the demand for energy from modern industry. And water, of course, the semiconductor industry itself has made huge advances over the past decade in reducing water use. But we need to still invest heavily in water infrastructure here in the United States and in China. And that's something that could actually have a very positive spillover for society in general. So, those two things, which are areas where they don't necessarily need to be political, I think are areas where we could see continued cooperation.
Kind of on the theme that Duncan just opened up of China bashing being very in vogue right now, I want to kind of return to my point earlier of making sure innovation doesn't catch this competition fever, and just kind of level set a little bit of like, what is the problem here? China has stated a very aggressive investment strategy and goals of building up their chip industry and their talent, but setting a goal and spending money does not in any way guarantee that they are going to eat our lunch in 10 years. Last week, Stip heard from Dr. Jeffrey Deng, who's a professor here at GW, and talking about China. And he mentioned, in the 80s, we were convinced that Japan was going to overtake us in technology. We were going to be left in the dust. We were going to lose all of our technology assets and positioning. And that has not happened. So bearing in mind that a lot of the things you're seeing breathless coverage of in the news is driven by the fact that it's a really great way to get attention. And often they're using metrics that are being gained by Chinese players. For instance, number of patents versus quality of patents. So when we actually sit down and think, what is actually happening here, it makes it easier to talk about collaborating with China on and where we can, because we're not so caught up in the fervor of China bashing, as Duncan said.
Well said. Let me ask, I was going to say, anyone want to pile onto that, but let me maybe ask the following question, and then maybe have Duncan and Jimmy, like, your thoughts on this too, to kind of build on this. So then, what should we, if we think about the Biden administration and Congress, we're coming up in a new year. What should we pay most attention to? We did a lot this year, thanks to the help of many of you on this call and many of those in the audience with us today, to get policy, get the CHIPS and Science Act passed. A lot of good thinking went into that and into the preparation to do a lot of work with allies. But as we think about the new year and thinking about now that we have the CHIPS and Science Act completed, and we have we implemented some export control measures, which we seem to be taking effect, as Cordell mentioned. Is this kind of topic off the legislative docket for a while, or is there more to come? I guess I'd ask maybe starting with Duncan and Jimmy, then ask others to weigh in. What would you suggest to kind of the Biden administration and Congress in terms of its 2023 calendar as it relates to these topics? What should it be thinking about? What policy measures, what kinds of education should be undertaken in cooperation with allies, industry, or others to make 2023 as successful as 2022 was in kind of moving this agenda forward?
Thanks, Don. I think this is a fundamentally important question. I mean, to quote a former vice president, now president of the United States, the CHIPS and Science Act and the export controls were a big something deal, right? You know, it's important that we celebrate those advances whilst recognizing that they haven't had purely positive implications. But you know, one thing that we do also have to say is that this is never a one and done deal. You know, this is as we've you know, said in a lot of our other work on supply chains, you know, you need to have a multi-dimensional approach. There's never going to be a silver bullet. You actually have to keep your eye on the ball, to mix metaphors in a horrible way. So, you know, what we're looking at, I think, in 2023 and 2024 is a need to really continue to focus on the hard work of strengthening the semiconductor industry here in the United States and in working with our allies. And that's going to take, I think, several different forms. Number one, yes, we need to support the diplomatic efforts of the US government in working with allies on the issue of semiconductors. And that probably means providing support, not just for the State Department, but also thinking of support for allies, financial support for allies who want to innovate in this area. Secondly, I would say, you know, the work that is ongoing in terms of innovation in the industry, we need to bring together the talent that exists around the world to work on these issues. Thirdly, on questions of water and energy, you know, we need to think about the ways in which the United States government can bring that together by working with industry to have a positive impact on reducing water use and in terms of increasing energy efficiency. But the one big issue that I would love to see for 2023 is actually on human capital, because, you know, as Jimmy and Kelly have said, and you've emphasized several times, Don, so much of this is actually about innovation, and innovation doesn't just happen by itself. It's actually a long and sometimes painful process, and it requires human beings who have received the right kind of education, have the right intellectual tools at their disposal. So we need to go back to basics once again and say, you know, in that CHIPS and Science Act, there are tens of billions of dollars available for STEM education and research and design. We need to think about how we spend that money and make more funds available in the right way so that we can strengthen the talent pool here in the United States. Part of that is through education. Part of that is going to ultimately come through immigration reform as well. But we need to think about where we're going to get the talent from to face the challenges of today and also the challenges of next year, the year after, etc.
Terrific. And maybe we only have a minute and a half left or so. Maybe Jimmy, give you the last word on this. Anything you'd add to the legislative kind of docket for next year, or the administrative, you know, kind of mindset for next year?
Well, I think a lot has already been touched upon. I just say CHIPS Act implementation. 2023 is going to be the sort of first opening year where the administration, Congress is going to be put to test around putting this historic legislation into effect, ensuring that it's going to be appropriated effectively, transparently, in a way that's going to bolster our supply chain resilience. So that I think, ultimately in the grand scheme of things, and this competition globally with China is going to be whether or not we can go to our own house in order and whether or not we can make the CHIPS Act a success. So that's going to be my suggestion for next year.
Perfect. Well, Jimmy, that's a great note to end on. And Duncan, thank you. Let me ask everyone to please thank, all of our panelists today, Alexandra, Duncan, Cordell, Kelly, and Jimmy, and really the talented Wilson Center staff that brought this all to you. Please use this as a start of a dialogue with everyone on the call, one of the panelists, and with the Wilson Center. I think chip literacy, chip lit, if you would, is going to be also a hallmark of staying on top of these issues. So please contact the center if you need to learn more, or the SIA as well. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at another Wilson Center event.